Every once in a while, Tim Pool gets something right. And his definition of kind of the woke religion, ideology, whatever you want to call it, is actually really fascinating. But what's even more fascinating for me is that the Christian theologian and philosopher Francis Schaeffer predicted this like 50 years ago. So I'm glad you're with me. Let's get into it.
Daily Wire posted a video on X. It's Ben Shapiro debating destiny. And Ben defines woke. And Ben is wrong in the majority of his definition.
What did he say?
He defines woke as this ideology rooted in postmodernism. He gives a long definition, but he basically says it's about power structures. It's about, those who in power tend to be bad. And I'm paraphrasing rather poorly, but he basically gives this ideological woke is, postmodernism with a racial component and then gender ideology. It's totally wrong.
So, but what is interesting to understand here is that postmodernity is sort of a critique of modernity. And so in a sense, wokeism I really don't like that term, but whatever. Wokeism is sort of post-modernity, if that makes sense. So I don't know the clip of Ben Shapiro that he's talking about, but certainly wokeism is connected to post-modernity in the sense that it has come out of post-modernity. And this will become more clear as we look at Francis Schaeffer, because again, he was dealing with this stuff in like the mid 1970s.
Woke is, postmodernism with a racial component and then gender ideology. It's totally wrong. Wokeness means adherence to the social orthodoxy of dominant institutions. That's it. That explains why. So the issue is, for someone like Ben, I can understand why he would say it this way. He's a political junkie. So he's looking at all the highest level things, and wokeness is identifiable in its root form. The average person who says woke does not mean any of that because they don't understand what that is. And so they'll refer to a woke person because they're flying the Ukraine flag or something in their profile picture. Why is it that there's an overlap between those who support critical race theory, gender ideology, and supporting war in Ukraine? Perhaps the argument can be made that because Russia is the power and Ukraine is weaker, therefore Russia is bad. Well, that doesn't really make sense because the U.S. is funding Ukraine to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. In fact, supporting Ukraine is supporting Western imperialism and hegemony. So why would they support going to war against Russia for Russia's border dispute? We in the West are the dominant power because all that really matters is woke is a reference to when someone adheres to the social orthodoxy of the dominant institutions.
Someone who adheres to the social orthodoxy of the dominant institutions. So in a sense, it is an ideology that is ever moving. It's not pinned down or anchored into a certain set of principles or presuppositions. And that's kind of what you would get after post-modernity. Again, modernism was sort of very clearly stated. Post-modernity gets a little bit more fuzzy, and then whatever comes out of post-modernity or whatever comes next would be even sort of less anchored to reality. But how do you sustain an ideology that isn't anchored? You just sort of look at what the other people in the mob are doing, and then you base your interaction with reality off of what you see other people doing.
And it's amorphous. Sometimes it's woke, sometimes it's woke in the esoteric sense. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's postmodernist, critical race theory, gender ideology. Sometimes it's absolutely not. And everyone falls in line. The best way to understand this is how the left uses a Mott and Bailey tactic. If woke truly was postmodernism, there would be no Mott and Bailey. They'd quite literally say, here's our argument, have a nice day. But they don't. They change their argument to a civil libertarian argument when threatened, showing there is no actual ideology here. It is simply just, we are a group that is in line with each other. We look for others who are wearing the same color clothing. And so long as we do that, and we're up to date on the latest fashion, we are aligned. That's what woke is. I describe it as a bunch of birds flying in the sky, flying in random directions. They occupy a very specific space. You can see them. Oh, they're over the lake. Yes, they have this weird leftist postmodernist thing to them. But they're really flying around and they can move at a moment's notice.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it also because, again, birds are not sort of anchored to the earth the way like mammals are, except for bats, which are really unique. But so you can think about how a flock of birds sort of moves almost as one thing. And I guess at times doesn't seem to have any particular direction. So that's the first analogy that I thought was actually really good, but it gets better.
So I tweeted a picture of something called an ant mill. You guys have heard of this?
No.
Ants, when they walk, they leave pheromone trails to signal to other ants where they went, what they're doing. They come back with food and they can follow that line. So you notice this in your kitchen, the line of ants. An ant mill is when the ants get turned around and form a circle.
Yeah.
What happens is they follow pheromones in a circle forever until they until they starve to death.
What? So here's what's also interesting about this is ants are, insects. They're bestial, and so they're left with just impulse. They're just reacting to their environment around them. And it's interesting if you think about like where kind of new atheism, or even where the conclusions of atheism would bring us, is really our mind. We're not really thinking right now. Our minds are just responding to sort of chemical interactions that are going on in our brains. It's determinism in that sense. It's a naturalistic form of determinism. You're not really thinking, you're just responding and reacting. I always find it interesting when an ideology takes humanity back to its bestial form, because I think that really there's two worldviews out there. If you think about it, there's theism, and then there's atheism or non-theism. There's people who believe in God, there's people who don't. And if you believe in God, it's like you tend to think, well, I'm created by God, and so I have maybe agency, or I have will. I'm sort of in a sense free to interact in the world. But if there is no God, then I am just a beast, and then evolution comes in to explain just how beast-like you are. So this illustration of an ant mill is actually really key, I think. I thought this was really good.
It's called a March of Death as well.
March of Death, a death
That
circle
really
in that mill.
happened?
Yes.
So they'll just walk in a circle until they...
Wow.
Because they can't see the big picture.
Yeah.
They're a tiny ant, and to them, they're just following the path. And the path is one big circle, and they're all following each other, and more keep funneling in until they eventually just starve to death or dehydration and die. That's wokeness. You join the circle, they're all following each other. You say, what is the ideology they hold? Whatever the ideology of the person in front of them holds. Yeah. It could be anything.
So it's the ideology of the person in front. It's mob. It's the mob. That's what it is. And this is where I think Schaefer really comes in and gives it. Well, okay, so here's a picture of this. Here's a picture of this ant death spiral, ant mill. There you go. If you're listening to this, or if you're watching this on YouTube, there's the idea, is that they get trapped in this sort of spiral of pheromones. And, again, Schaefer is really good. It takes a little bit to unpack his philosophy, and so I'll do the best that I can here. This is he's still very much within the modern world. I don't even think post-modernity was a term yet, and yet here I think Schaefer is even kind of projecting beyond post-modernity to look at the conclusions that I think we're kind of living through today. So it's, again, fascinating.
The history of the non-Christian philosophers up until the 18th century went like this. Here is a circle which stands for what the unified and true knowledge of the universe is. Then the next man would say no and cross out the circle. But he then would say, here is the circle. And the next man would say no and cross out that circle. Then he would make his circle. And the next man would cross it out and make his circle. This continued through the centuries.
So the idea is that there's an exchange of ideas. The idea is that there's an exchange of ideas. So what Schaefer is illustrating here is that someone would put forth kind of their idea of what would a unified idea that would accurately describe the world around us, reality as it really is. And then as philosophers engaged in this exchange of ideas, they would sort of prove each other wrong, cross out their ideas, build off of their ideas. Now, what would happen, though, is, you have this exchange of ideas, and in a sense, everybody coming after is proposing a new idea. But what happens in postmodernity is that instead of crossing out the circle and drawing a new circle, postmodernity just sort of crossed out the circle of modernity. That's kind of what they did. They didn't draw a new circle. They kind of were just critical of modernity. And what then are we left with if there is an ideology that is just critical of other ideologies around it without putting forth a new ideology. Again, think of the circles, think of that ant circle that Tim Pool was talking about.
1970, which ended so ugly, in such an ugly fashion in Europe. After that, drug taking changed. Mind you, not less people taking drugs unhappily, but no longer taking them as an ideology. The unhappy thing is probably more people are taking drugs.
So he's talking about the drug culture in the late 60s, early 70s, as an attempt to sort of solve the meaning crisis. After there's no God, what are we left with? We're left with our experiences. And so how do we sort of elevate those experiences so that they're powerful enough for us to make sense of the world? Well, psychedelics come in and play a role. So he's talking about that as what humanity attempted, a solution there, and it ultimately failed. So now humanity is going to attempt another solution in the realm of ideology,
and taking them at a younger age. But drug taking as an ideology was absolutely done. The New Left went the same way, gradually ground down. It brought forth naturally violence in the United States, violence in Europe, and the idealistic young people really didn't like the violence that it just reasonably and naturally brought forth. In 1970, the radical students bombed the University of Wisconsin lab building, killing a graduate student. Bombs continue to be planted in the United States, and a small, hard core of radicals continues to exist.
And a small group of hardcore radicals continue to exist. Where do they exist today? If they were in the university in 1970, where do you think those people are today? I'll let you draw the conclusion. Usually these platforms don't like it when I get too deep down that rabbit hole, but I think you know where they are. If you're paying attention, you know where they are.
But the violence of the New Left, climaxing in the bombing of this laboratory building, made most young people in the United States no longer see the New Left as a hope. So here the students were, and they had tried to escape these two awful values of personal peace and fluency, and now their two hopes, the New Left and the drug thing, was gone. What were they left with? And they were left with apathy. Apathy. Many, many people were so glad when the universities quieted down at that time. And in one way, it's good. It did quiet down. But I could have wept, and I did weep as I met these young people after this. All they had left was apathy. And they had tried to escape their parents' poor values, or society's poor values, and they'd gone around in a circle and come back and ended 1 inch lower.
And there you have it. They've gone around in a circle, and they've ended up 1 inch lower than when they began. And that circle continues. And that's the idea of the death spiral of the ants. It's, for the ants, they just become exhausted. But for humanity, that spiral pulls you downward. There's a gravity to this process that should be pointed out, that Schaeffer is getting to here. And that is every turn of the circle sort of brings you one step lower. And essentially what Schaeffer is talking about, particularly when he's talking about the circles that he was drawing in the sand as philosophical attempts to explain the world, is that you sort of begin in this realm of theism. The gods are at work in the world, that they're moving history around. And then somebody says, well, gods aren't really active in the world that way, or God isn't. But we don't know how to explain how everything got to be. So we sort of still need God to explain how everything came into being, but we don't need God to explain the events of human history. So there's theism that sort of spirals downward into deism. Now God is distant from being engaged in humanity. And eventually naturalism comes in and says, well, now we don't really need God to explain how the world was created or how things came into being. We can do that. We've got this, we're the scientific revolution, modernism, the age of reason. We're going to be able to explain it all. And that has ultimately failed. And you can think of Nietzsche and some of these philosophers who saw the conclusion of that sort of reductionist naturalism, again, bringing humanity down into the level of a beast. so there's this naturalism, there's apathy. The sort of hippies of the 1960s, they tried drugs, they tried the ideological left, and they were caught in apathy. And so what happens is they have to take a leap somewhere. They have to take a leap into something, and to Schaeffer's point is actually that there's a risk here that you leap into the area of non-reason. I'm just looking for a question mark, but I guess not. I won't have one of those. And you leap into the area of non-reason, or you make an illogical leap to attach yourself to an ideology, despite that ideology not being sufficient. And so he's gonna. I think I interrupted him a little bit too soon here, but and so that's where we are. We're at this place of where then, if there's no God and we've lost the meaning crisis, and drugs can't help us, and the new left can't help us, postmodernism didn't help us. What are we left with?
And now apathy ruled with them, and what was left? The two values of personal peace and affluency now ruled supreme. Now, turning away from the United States, a dominant, strong minority in Europe, and a majority of students, for example, let's say in South America and other parts of the world, they turned to a new leap into the area of non-reason. And that is, they committed themselves to the Marxist, Leninist, or the Maoist line.
That's where we are. It happened in Europe and elsewhere first, I think, because of the way in which sort of Christianity influenced, America. There's a lot there to sort of unpack, but maybe that's just better put as a question. Why is it that the communist ideology took root in Europe and elsewhere first? I think it's because they were post-Christian, but you can let me know what you think. And then eventually it moved into America. I think what we saw in the universities is a sort of a Leninist attempt at another revolution that got so much pushback that those who were trying to incite the revolution realized, oh no, we're going too far too fast. We need to kind of go underground. And in a sense, America's not ready yet for this liberation, this revolution that we're going to impose upon them. And so now we're there.
Why is this a new kind of leap into the area of non-reason, as utopian in a bad sense as the old drug leap? Well, I'll tell you why. It's simply because everywhere where Marxian Leninism has come to power, it has always meant oppression. Always. And these young people just close their eyes to that.
They close their eyes to the fact that inherent within the Marxist system is conflict, is oppression. And this is kind of the idea. And I've used this before in other podcasts, but I just thought, again, it's worth looking at this. The mechanism that drives communism, socialism as an ideology is conflict. The slaves have to overthrow the slave owners. The serfs have to overthrow the lords. The bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And out of each conflict arrives a new synthesis. This is Hegel's dialectic, right? This is what Marx is sort of applying it to economic theory and what have you. And again, it's almost like a spiral. They think, in fact, it should be going down. I should redraw this so that we're sort of going down. I mean, maybe that would be too weird, but that's kind of the idea. We're in this place where there's been an illogical leap again into the area of sort of non-reason. Why? Because the hope is utopia. The hope is like the dignity of humanity. The hope is what it's always said to be like saving people or coming into the defense of those people who have been marginalized, only to marginalize them again or marginalize other people. Or it's like C.S. Lewis said, the chief triumph of humanity will be the abolition of man. We think we're about to gain victory, and what we end up doing is self-sabotage. And so I don't know actually if C.S. Lewis said that. I think that's attributed to C.S. Lewis. That's his book, The Abolition of Man, but I don't know that he said it exactly like that. So maybe I've got that wrong. So then what are we left with? And I think, this is where I think of Paul. Why would we be talking about communism? Why would we be talking about postmodernity and sort of the woke ideology on a channel that's dedicated to theology? Well, because you can't escape the fact that we live in God's world, I think. And so God has created this world. And there are spiritual forces. It's not just a naturalistic world. And so Paul VanderKlay kind of dives into this idea of what then is our hope? If we've followed this sort of line of thinking all the way down into this nihilistic place of an illogical leap. And again, Schaeffer's fear here is that leap goes into non-reason. I think there's a possibility that we leap back into theism.
They have a patterned way of thinking. They have a patterned way of belief. Now, again, in modernity, belief is so abstracted, but they have a patterned way of life. They have a patterned way of behavior that is dominated by their principality.
Okay. That is the ant circle. They've created this pattern. They're following after whoever's in front of them. Okay. And that's governed by this principality.
They have a patterned way of life. They have a patterned way of behavior that is dominated by their principality. And the only way that is going to change is if a stronger principality comes and unseats it.
The only way that's going to change is if a stronger principality comes in and unseats it. How do we escape the death spiral of these ants? Is there a way out? And the great thing is, there is a way out.
Bread pill, conversion, transformation. A stronger power has to take hold of it and exercise it. Why is it that I keep calling Jordan Peterson the unauthorized exorcist? Well, because what is he doing? He is exorcising people who have been in domination. They have had a place in the matrix, a place in the superorganism, and they are pulled from that and they are brought into another one. I mean, these conversations, this is what drove me crazy when I first started doing this, because my other clergy couldn't see because they're all dominant within, basically so deep within the church organism that they couldn't see out of it. This is all New Testament language that's going on here.
And so is it that and Francis Schaeffer was frustrated with the church. If you look at some of his later works, and particularly I'm thinking of the Christian Manifesto, that book, I mean, he does get critical of the church for their lack of engagement in this area or lack of awareness of what's actually going on. Because in a way, what has happened is the church, I think because people have not really truly given their lives to Jesus, maybe, I'm getting a little bit, haven't truly sort of died to self, is that the church as an institution has just become another tool for creating the ant spiral. We're just going to follow everybody. We're just going to follow the person in front of us. And so they couldn't see out of that ant spiral. They couldn't see out of the organism of the church and look at the world around. Schaeffer is predicting woke ideology in 1976. He's predicting the consequences of postmodernity before postmodernity even became a term. He could see it because I think because he was God had called him for a particular time and equipped him, and unfortunately, I mean, you can listen to Frankie Schaeffer's testimony. Is unfortunately, Frankie Schaeffer is Francis's son. Francis and Edith were, at least according to Frankie, they were so committed to their calling that they sort of overlooked some areas of their personal life. But Schaeffer was able to see out of the institution of the church and predict where society was going. I think because he understood Scripture. I think because he had a relationship with the Holy Spirit. I think that he was inspired by that and was sensitive to the needs of the people. He was aware of the meaning crisis prior to there ever really many other people being aware of that meaning crisis.
And there's a world of complexity and nuance out there, but when we read history, don't we recognize things? So yeah, it's low resolution. Yeah, it's limited in participation, but some spirits come around again. In fact, when Jordan Peterson and many in the IDW 1.0 are anxious about what wokeism is going to do, they are worried that the spirit, let's say the spirit of communism, is going to once again descend and occupy the people.
You're welcome.
This isn't new to us.
It's not new.
We don't talk like this most of the time, but isn't this exactly what we're talking about?
All right. And this is why I keep coming back to Ephesians 6. I think that our struggle is not against flesh and blood. We all kind of get that. Be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. And again, a stronger principality needs to come and unseat wokeism, kick people out of the ant spiral. A stronger and the strongest person, the strongest principality in that sense is the Spirit of God, the Spirit of our Creator, who would bring us back into harmony with him, with the Creator, with the creation, so that we could be in harmony with one another, so that the promise of the leftist ideology of utopia could actually be received. Because the promise is always given by these ideologies, but they can't achieve that promise. How do we achieve that promise? Through the Creator. Put on the full armor of God. And I think it's really important that God has not left us without equipment in this particular battle that we are in, so that you'll be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the full armor of God. I hope that that's an encouragement for you, that there is a stronger power, there is a stronger principality that can unseat these other principalities that are very strong. Because again, it's really a battle against the people who are giving their lives to God, the Creator, or who are living their lives for themselves. This is the Tower of Babel. Let us make a name for ourselves. That is where the humanism as an ideology, and again, I just did this video on transhumanism and stuff like that, this idea that we can become God. We don't need God, we can become God. And I think that we are really, in a way, I think, sitting on the precipice of this. Where do we leap? Are we going to leap? See, that's going to cover it up. Are we going to leap into this area of transhumanism, that this illogical idea that we could somehow become gods? Or are we going to leap back into, in the garden, God gave us one rule, right? That we would live in obedience. And so are we going to go back and submit to the one who has given us life? And I know obedience and submission, these are bad terms for those of us who have lived in this sort of naturalistic world. But I think of it more as harmony. God is the author. He is the hero of this story, and we can participate with that story in a way that is in harmony with him or in rebellion to him. That's really it. And I think it's encouraging that we can live in harmony, and that is a powerful force. That's why these videos tend to not get shared a lot on YouTube. YouTube doesn't want to share these videos. There are other principalities and forces at work. So if you made it all the way to the end, I ask you to help me out there a little bit and share it, because I think, again, this podcast is centered around dialogue and conversation about the things that I think are the most important. The chief one among those is what comes into our mind when we think about God, because that will determine how we live in this world. All of what we have just talked about, Sounds like a lot of politics, sounds like a lot of history, sounds like a lot of that. In the end, it's theology, because there are people living consistently with an idea that there is no God and that they can become God. And then there are other people living consistent with an idea that there is a God and there is a way out of the death spiral of the beast. There's a way out of the ideological traps that are happening. So with that, I hope you are well, and I will catch you in the next one.